My name is Robin Newman, and I have a company known as the Huntington Relationship Center, and I am an Imago therapist.
And my name is David Weber, and I too have my own practice, the Holistic Counseling Center of Long Island, and I too am an Imago Relationship Therapist. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of collaborating with Robin over the years, and we're going to talk about some ideas and things that show up in our day-to-day practice and how they impact couples.
So one thing that David and I were discussing was the fact that people think that because we are relational therapists, that precludes an individual from coming in and getting everything that they need in a session. So I've gone down that rabbit hole with people, trying to explain to them that Imago is object relations oriented, attachment oriented, where everything goes back to childhood, and
psychodynamic theory as well. So the things that we experience in childhood show up in our intimate partner relationships as adults.
yes, it's also solution focused and gestalt. So all of these components together are extremely beneficial in trauma work.
Sure.
So I was sharing with David before we started to do this clip about an individual that came to see me that was a referral from another therapist. And I always appreciate referrals from therapists because that shows me that I'm doing my job out there.
Sure.
Those are always the best referrals. And she chose to not go with me because she said I was a romantic therapist and she wanted to be, and if she were to go into a romantic relationship, then she would choose me to be the therapist. And when a situation like that occurs, I don't know about you, but I don't even bother to push back because I think in every session I explain myself very clearly about what the basis is for Imago.
Right.
So have you also experienced something like this occasionally?
To some extent, yes. I think that, one of the things that I spend a little bit of time on, and I'm sure you do as well, is some of the things that we've talked about. Letting people know that a lot of the way they show up in intimate partner relationships today are based on the archetypes of both how to be a male or female and what to expect from a male or female by observing their primary caregivers.
Correct.
And so, working with what I would term, or the modern term of, little t traumas, whether it be neglect or that kind of thing from parents, or functionally absent fathers, for example, for young women. I find that, when I start to delve in that way rather than focus on, because I think that people don't really understand what Imago is, the scope and the breadth of what it can actually do.
I absolutely agree.
And so we actually, so I do use it on an individual level too. And, with the caveat that ultimately, you can't work on how you show up in relationships as a single person, for example. The only way to do that is be in a relationship. So you're only going to get so far working on your own. However, if you do a lot of that foundational work, it makes communication and growing deeper emotional intimacy much more likely in any relationship as you move out of the honeymoon phase.
I agree with that. Also, what's interesting is everything is relationship.
True.
Because what we do tend to do is we tend to replicate our family history in our places of work, in our friendships with people, obviously in our families, because that's where it stems from. And I find that at least with being a relational therapist, an Imago relationship therapist, that it's so helpful for an individual. Because there are times when they don't recognize that they are replicating their parental units, their siblings, their whole role in their job, and they're miserable in their job.
Right.
And when you start to delve deeper into that, to look at the archetypes of the background of everything that's happening, they're blown away.
Sure.
And I always say that, have a relationship with yourself, understand yourself, how you call into patterns, how you I think of rolling down a hill and collecting moss as you're rolling down the hill.
Right.
It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. but to really gear into that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure.
You
And I think
know?
that oftentimes, with some of the defenses that people create in childhood, for example, in order to deal with perhaps an overbearing parent, or, what Freud might have called the devouring mother, for example.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Gosh, I remember that.
Some of those things, I think that people, they have that tendency to replicate those defenses in their relationships. So, for example, that can show up, especially when you do have a devouring mother, for example. It may show up in the sense of, immediate defensiveness and, slipperiness when it comes to conflict.
Yeah.
Not really willing to accept or responsibility or take accountability for one's own behavior.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to point a finger at someone else rather than it is to say, okay, I'm contributing to my partner in the way they're showing up here today with me.
Right. My favorite AA saying, and I always say that I love working with people in recovery because AA has the best metaphors. When you point a finger at someone else, there's three pointing back at yourself.
Definitely.
My grandmother, I taught her that phrase and she loved it. She used to use it all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's very, very true.
Sure. I use it often in my practice as well,
Yeah.
especially because some of my background in recovery and, through the trauma-informed recovery
Yeah.
and the work that I've done.
Yeah, yeah.
So
it's interesting because, it's funny. I was just telling somebody today that I also think what's great about Imago is, and this person has had a lot of exposure to Imago therapy, is to listen to your gut. Because usually your gut is right.
Sure.
We go into override.
Right.
Because if something's familiar, we immediately fall into the pattern of saying, oh, this is my soulmate. They finish my sentences.
Yes.
But sometimes that's not real.
Right.
Most of the time that's not real.
Right.
And if you do have a feeling about something as a single person,
Sure.
then don't proceed.
Right.
Investigate it in therapy and then go cautiously.
Sure. I think that, there's an interesting book that's out and it kind of describes things about love and the concept of limerence as well. That feeling of being in love. What is that all about? And there's some interesting research just starting to demonstrate that the whole butterflies things that everybody seeks in a relationship is actually a trauma warning that something's not quite right.
It's cortisol.
Right.
Yes, it's cortisol.
Right.
That's what people don't understand is, I have flutters in my stomach.
Right.
You're making those flutters.
Right.
And it's funny because when we do the workshop, which we will plug at some point, when we do the workshop, that's one of the first things we say is that those flutters that you're feeling in your stomach or, the sweaty
Yes.
palms, the chest stuff, that's all created by you.
Right.
Not created by the partner person, but that is trauma.
Right. And that's an early warning that something's
Yes,
not quite
it is.
right.
Do you ever think of Will Robinson?
Yes.
Boston Space Danger,
Robot. Yeah, the
Will
robot.
Robinson.
Yeah. We're showing our age.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's I think it was since nobody's really taught what it is that they should be looking for in relationships because there's no concept of that in our education system, and so it's the person that brings you peace. That when you're if you're cuddling with them or you're laying with them and you actually feel peaceful for the first time in your life, or even maybe more than once, but I mean, you do have that sense of peace. That's the person. They may not feel as exciting right off the bat.
That's exactly what I was talking to this person about today. Don't look for the excitement.
Right. It's actually going to feel a little boring.
It is.
Right.
That's exactly what we connected with on today. And it's funny because I was explaining to them that when I first met this husband 22 years ago, I was curious. There were things I looked at, but there wasn't rockets. There weren't fireworks, and it took 8 months to get to a place of where there was just a real feeling of safety, just knowing that. And I think we're also conditioned to go for the rockets,
Right.
and for the all of the intense feelings and the sex and all of that because of society and what's inflicted on us. And I say inflicted because we take it,
Sure.
and then we run with it.
We want someone to take our breath away, as they would say.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
And that's not necessarily a healthy thing.
No, it is not.
There are ways to go about that can actually work.
Yeah,
But that in the very beginning, I think that's the most unhealthy sort of indicator.
Yeah.
Is using the opposite, using that that feeling of taking my breath away and saying, "Man, well, that might feel good now, but
it ain't going to feel good later."
Especially when you get into the power struggle portion
yes.
of Imago, and that's after the honeymoon phase.
Yes.
So it's that not so much power or struggle for dominance as I understood it, right? And I'm sure you see it the same way.
Yes.
But it's more the power struggle is the power to be heard and understood.
Absolutely.
And that feeling won't help you because actually it'll be gone in about 2 years.
Yes, it will.
So if you're looking for a monogamous long-term relationship.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, totally agree with that.
And so at that point too is what we see with couples frequently is, attempting to bend the truth a little bit in an attempt to get along.
Yeah.
And so, it often shows up in my relationship counseling and with my individuals where I often have to counsel that thoughts, words, and deeds have to align.
Absolutely.
And, when words and deeds don't, people can detect that. And so, that shows up in a form of defensiveness. It shows up in a form of almost like wriggling like a snake or a worm type of stuff. And people will smell that.
They do.
And then what it does is begin to erode trust.
Yes, it does. And then the trust creates conflict.
Correct.
And then that, a lot of times people don't want to work through the conflict.
Right.
But if we look right up there, in conflict there is growth. That is my favorite
Sure.
Imagoism.
Sure.
Which is so true because most people, when that happens, they then end up fleeing.
Right.
Or, if they're more reptilian and not monkeys, they'll end up fleeing,
Sure.
because it's the fight or flight syndrome. So,
right.
But that's a really good point. It's very true. It really is. I see that often, and I try to explain to people that actions, words have to align.